When Dallas, Kane, and Lambert step out of the Nostromo's airlock, they are not only led into a foreboding alien world, they are entering the nightmarish mind of one of the greatest dark surrealist artists who's ever lived, Hans Rudy Giger. This whole sequence is like stepping into a series of Giger paintings, and along with its importance in setting up the rest of the movie, the mystery that is created heightens the terror surrounding the monster. So let's go through this sequence from beginning to end, and look at how everything was created from concept to execution.
What happened to Kane?
Something has attached itself to him. We have to get him to the infirmary right away.
What kind of thing? I need a clear destination.
An organism. Open the hatch.
Early on in the production, before even Ridley Scott was hired, Alien screenwriter and visual design consultant Dan O'Bannon hired his friend Ron Cobb and a colleague from Alejandro Jodorowsky's failed Dune adaptation named Chris Foss. They would begin making concept art for Alien while O'Bannon tried to convince the producers to bring on Giger, another Dune contributor, to design the monster. When Scott signed on, O'Bannon showed Scott Giger's Necronomicon book, and Scott demanded Giger be brought on board to turn this painting of his into the movie's monster. Cobb was tasked with designing the spaceships, both the human spaceship, the Nostromo, as well as the alien spaceship, what would be called the Derelict. But there was a problem. Cobb's logical brain was so good at designing the rational that he had a difficult time designing something truly alien in a way that made sense for the movie. O'Bannon said, "All these different things Cobb was doing were coming out so well that I decided to have him take a crack at the derelict spaceship. But when I asked him to come up with an irrational shape, he got very disturbed. He couldn't handle that. He kept coming up with convincing technology for a flying saucer or some kind of UFO." So O'Bannon had Chris Foss try a version, and he came up with a couple of designs. O'Bannon said, "I conceptualized the derelict as a gnome's castle, colorful and interesting and bizarre as hell, but not morbid. Chris Foss did a wonderful painting of the ship, which is still my favorite. It was a beautiful bronze lobster-like thing sitting on the sand, very technological, very odd-looking, very difficult to figure out quite how it would fly." But after seeing more of Giger's artwork, Scott realized he could play up the contrast of styles by having Cobb design the bulk of the human technology, and the surrealist Giger would not just design the monster, but everything alien. Besides the monster, Giger was responsible for the alien technology, the derelict spacecraft, and even the alien planet itself. The clashing styles of artists fully separates the human from the alien, and what we get is not just a Giger monster, but an entire Giger world brought to life. On July 26th, production moved from Stage C to Stage H, which just happened to be the same stage that one of Scott's favorite movies, 2001: A Space Odyssey, filmed its own interaction with an alien artifact. Stage H would house the completed derelict on one end, and the 40-foot-high landing leg of the Nostromo on the other, with the alien landscape in between.
Can't see a goddamn thing.
Quit griping.
I like griping.
Come on, knock it off.
Giger worked with production designer Michael Seymour to design the planet's surface and the derelict ship, using Giger's biomechanical style as an underlying principle. You can see how the landscape concept almost looks like a horrifying mishmash of flesh, bones, and machines. Because of budget constraints, Giger simplified his design before making a small version of the landscape for the builders to work from, using plaster, real bones, and mechanical things. Scott said, "Studio landscape is bloody difficult. You're constantly staring at plaster rocks and saying, 'Christ, this doesn't look right.'" He had wanted to shoot the alien landscape on location, with only a few shots in the studio, but they couldn't afford it. Of course, he would get to do this on Prometheus, filming in Iceland, Jordan, and other visually striking locations. Giger's three-dimensional design was split into parts and built on the Shepperton film set. These large sets were made by first building a frame and covering it with wire netting and plastic-soaked sheeting. The structures were essentially hollow. Large tubing was integrated into the landscape, and scenic artist Ken Hill and his team painted the backdrop with brushes and spray guns. Before shooting the Nostromo crew on the planetoid, the production team pumped the set full of smoke to fill out the expanse. And get this, the smoke was composed of a low-grade diesel fuel, vaporized and suspended in the air. They were filming in England, and some of these effects would have not been up to code in the US. For example, in the US, the smoke would have had to have been water-based. Some of the crew even remembered clouds forming at the heights of Stage H from all of the smoke, fuel, and wind. To create the dust storm, they used huge wind machines to blow vermiculite particles all over the set. Vermiculite looks like small pebbles, but it's very lightweight, and they went through 200 or 300 bags a day. The planetoid surface was lit with a couple of searchlights, just a few brutes, and a light known as a Wendy light. Since there wasn't time and money to make the landscape exactly as Giger would have liked, Scott used dark lighting and smoke to hide the less complete parts. Michael Seymour said, "The alien landscape was really just a collection of shapes, and unless one saw it only in carefully lighted conditions, it looked like exactly that. Obviously, when you're striving for believability, the last thing you want is a set that looks like a set. Here, you can get a good view of the set before the fog and dust storm were added. The black part here would be replaced with a matte painting, and this is the painting of the planets we see beyond the horizon in the movie. When the dust storm finally passes, the crew members find themselves in a place that is eerily quiet, and after trekking through narrow rock formations, they finally see it."
Ash, can you see this?
Yes, I can. I've never seen anything like it.
Interestingly, very early on, Scott had French illustrator and yet another Dune concept artist named Mobius try designing the Derelict, which Scott liked for its slightly archaic, faintly Victorian look, but it simply wasn't strange or unearthly enough. This design even made its way into Scott's original storyboards. Of course, Giger would later be asked to apply his otherworldly surrealism to the Derelict spaceship.
The Derelict is a flying machine, and I think if one does encounter, something at some point or other, I think it will be just so peculiar that it will be like nothing we expect. I wanted to do something which would evoke, I think, immediate, slightly gothic revulsion. It's sort of spooky, but it's sort of elegant, but there's something very worrying about it.
Giger said, "Ridley asked me if I could design a spaceship not made by human beings. Well, how do you do that? I thought maybe it might look organic, something that could grow even, like a plant, but I didn't know exactly what it should look like." On March 5th, 1978, Giger showed Scott these sketches and a painting of his derelict ship idea that he made early one morning when he couldn't get back to sleep. Giger continues saying, "It ended up like an aerodynamic bone with little technical stuff all over it, but it wasn't really anything I had planned. It just sort of ran out of my mind in my airbrush, which is not uncommon for me. Often I try to switch off my thoughts as much as possible and let the painting flow out spontaneously from my subconscious mind." O'Bannon thought that the ship didn't look technical enough, but Scott loved it. During the ensuing argument, Giger kept quiet knowing that Scott would win. But on July 19th, producer Gordon Carroll, who previously liked the Derelict design, told Giger to redesign it because he said it looked too much like the landscape and it wouldn't be immediately clear that it was a downed spaceship. Giger suspected O'Bannon had something to do with the sudden change, and tried to argue that making something more technical would lose what makes it alien. Scott quietly presented a boring-looking spacecraft, which Giger understood was simply to placate Carroll, writing in his diary, "Promising to try something different, I go back to my work. This is an occasion when time will work for me." Scott said, "There's a great tendency in this business not to use the first thing you come up with. As a result, people often just work something to death. What we were looking for here was a totally alien-looking spacecraft. I didn't think it would be something with a lot of lights on it and stuff like that. I figured it would be like nothing anyone ever imagines. Either that, or extraordinarily familiar and slightly archaic looking." And Giger's first drawing was just a knockout. I took one look at it and said, "That's it." Other people couldn't quite see it though, so I had to keep digging my heels in and saying, "You won't get a better Derelict. Don't screw about with it." Giger is a special case, and when something's that good, you have to recognize it and just leave it alone. So the Derelict design came out of Giger's mind over a few hours, which is pretty much the opposite of designing the Nostromo. If you haven't seen that episode, check it out after this one. It really makes you think what the Derelict might have looked like if Giger had been able to sleep that night. So the design was in, but Giger's otherworldly design was so unusual that it was proving difficult to build. Special effects supervisor Brian Johnson said, "As a two-dimensional painting, it looked very logical, but there was no way you could actually build it in 3 dimensions. So I got together with Giger and we talked about some possible modifications. Then he went off and redid the drawing. From that we produced another polystyrene shape, which he thought was pretty good." Even though photos of the model shop were apparently forbidden, special effects guys John Sorensen, Roger Nichols, and Dennis Lowe took tons of great pictures, which is where a lot of these come from. The Derelict miniature was built by Peter Voisey, working closely with Giger. They would carve the shape out of polystyrene, which is kind of like styrofoam, and then cover it in plasticine, which is like a soft putty, They could then stick things like plastic tubes and pieces from model kits to give it a realistic texture, and then they would paint the outside. And it was great because it wouldn't melt under the heat of the stage lights and would stay soft so they could make adjustments whenever. The model of the Derelict wound up being around 4 feet long, and the landscape in which it was set took up a whole room. Bones, including human skulls, were among the materials used to make the miniature landscape. Scott had obviously been really busy with other aspects of the movie, so when he finally arrived to the soundstage at Brace Studios where they were shooting the models and saw everything completed, he became concerned that because everything was so small, it would be difficult to communicate the scale of the Derelict to the audience. He stared at the model for a while, and then had an idea. Videotape cameras were pretty new at the time, and Scott asked the crew if anyone had one. Someone did, and he had them run home and get it.
So I simply got a domestic tape camera and walked through the set like this, putting that in the background, then put it back through a TV monitor, then filmed off the monitor. So that's why somehow it looks high tech and suddenly has this massive scale. And that was because I had to do it.
And this is great. Once they had the Derelict placed on the miniature landscape, they added 3 1.5-inch tall puppets of Kane, Lambert, and Dallas on an 18-inch motorized track with little helmet lights to get some wide shots of them approaching the ship. The crew finally arrives at the Derelict ship to find some openings that allow them inside. Only this small portion of the Derelict exterior was built full scale. The egg-shaped doorways, or let's face it, something else shaped, it is Giger after all, were made out of wood and plaster. The set was built about 100 feet across and 30 feet high and just used for one shot. But there was going to be another shot. They had filmed a wide shot using a matte painting that showed more of the ship, but it was cut. This is what it would have looked like. The full-scale set would be here with a matte painting surrounding it. O'Bannon's original script had the Derelict ship next to a large pyramid in which the eggs would be found. Early on, the pyramid was scrapped because of budget constraints, and the eggs would be found on the Derelict ship itself. The idea was that the alien would be incorporated into the religion and culture of an ancient civilization. O'Bannon said, "We are dealing with a different alien here. The dead ship appears to be a visitor from elsewhere. The pyramid seems indigenous. Walking around it, they can find no entrance. Any entrance must have been buried under the shifting sands of time. So Kane uses his climbing gear to crawl to the top of the monolith, where he finds an open shaft going straight down." Back in the very, very early days of the project, O'Bannon himself commissioned concept art for Alien from Giger. These were mainly concerning the alien's life cycle, but one of the paintings was Giger's interpretation of the temple, or what would be called the egg silo. You can see these weird needle things on the side. I believe this idea was taken from Giger's concept art for Dune. It looks pretty similar, but if you're keeping track, this needle thing was scrapped twice. In this concept by Chris Foss, we can see Kane descending through the shaft into the temple. And in this concept by Ron Cobb, we see Kane inside the temple and evidence of an ancient culture surrounding the alien. It is at this point in O'Bannon's original script that the crew members back on the Nostromo translate the alien signal and it says, "Do not land." But this was all scrapped and it was now Giger's job to design the inside of the Derelict ship. The idea for the Derelict was that it would be like the Mary Celeste, a famous ship that was found drifting with no one on board as if everyone suddenly disappeared. The style would be almost like being inside of a creature. When Giger was a child, he had what he called a secret window in his home, and he'd look out at a dark shaft between 2 nearby buildings. He had recurring nightmares about bottomless shafts and endless corridors that influenced many of his paintings. He decided to incorporate this fear into the interior of the Derelict.
I can't see the end. Oh, that looks like a line.
Well, I think we should try it. If we've got this far, we must go on.
Dallas, Kane, and Lambert make their way down a corridor until they come upon another strange sight.
Alien life form. Looks like it's grown out of the chair.
As I mentioned in a previous episode, the idea for the dead pilot of a crashed spaceship likely came from a 1966 movie called Queen of Blood, where astronauts investigating a distress signal find a crashed alien ship with the pilot dead inside. But a special thanks to Andy Wines, who sent me a tip that there's something else similar to the alien story in the first episode of the Star Trek animated series from 1973. The crew picks up a signal of unknown origin.
That's the source of the radio emissions.
And then comes across a derelict alien ship in space. They explore it to find that it has been intentionally destroyed millions of years ago, and then find that the signal translates to a message saying that the inhabitants of the ship were carrying a dangerous life form when they began to be drawn to a planet and decided to destroy the ship themselves rather than unleash the life form on other worlds. The Enterprise crew then escapes back to the ship, but they accidentally bring the life form back with them. But despite where the idea came from, the audience would need to see the dead pilot of the derelict ship. Before Scott was hired, O'Bannon had Ron Cobb working on what this dead pilot would look like. O'Bannon said, "For the inside, Ron Cobb did the skeleton, what they later called the space jockey, and it was perfect. It had a very large cranium and 4 or 5 eye sockets, very small jawbone, no teeth to speak of. Of course, I expected it to look horrible when you first see it in the film, but then if you looked at it a bit closer, you discovered that it didn't have large teeth or the mandibles or any of the other things that are characteristic of a carnivore. And then maybe you'd begin to imagine it as some totally non-violent, herbivorous creature sailing around in space." Giger said, "From the script I knew he was huge and had a hole in his chest, but that was all." Scott found this creature in Giger's Necronomicon book of art and told Giger to base the space jockey off of it. Scott said, "I wanted a fossil, almost. One which you'd have a hard time deciding where he leaves off and the chair on which he died begins. So here they are with this dead space jockey, frozen in death to the weapon he was firing when he died. And he's kind of gargoyle-like and spooky." Giger said, "The creature we finally ended up building is biomechanical to the extent that he has physically grown into, or maybe even out of, his seat. He's integrated totally into the function he performs. Aside from the chair and creature itself, actually building the room around the space jockey was a problem, considering it was so impractically large and the production was already strained. Some of the studio executives wanted it scrapped completely." Talking about the space jockey, Scott said, "We were already over budget and running about 3 weeks behind schedule, which I don't think was that unreasonable for that sort of film, personally. So at one point it was going to be ditched, but we rigidly held on to it. We felt we had to have it in there as some sort of central element in the craft. I mean, to have them walk in there and find nothing, just a hole in the floor, was absolutely bloody pointless." Scott, producer Gordon Carroll, and associate producer Ivor Powell fought hard to keep it in the movie. Production designer Michael Seymour came up with the idea of building only half the set and placing the creature on a turntable in the center so they could cheat different angles. Giger also designed the wall to the set, which had a complex design, but since it was a repeating pattern, they were able to make a mold for the nearly 100 sections that make up the wall. To make the space jockey itself, Giger and supervising modeler Peter Voisey sculpted the detail into clay on top of a basic plaster form on a wooden frame. The team then covered the whole thing in plaster that they would then use to make a mold for a resin casting. Some parts like the gun and the seat detail were made using carvings from foam, similar to how they made the derelict model. For the big reveal, they were so pressed for time that they ended up filming the wide shot of the space jockey before it was fully finished.
Sometimes it also happened that I was not ready in time. You will see that with the space jockey, that it's only half paint, and he had to film that absolutely the other day. I was crazy. It was at night working on this shitty. Yeah.
Giger begged Scott not to shoot it while it was only half painted, but Scott assured him that they would print the film darker. But when Giger saw it, he thought that first shot looked terrible, and it was obvious that the wide shot made it appear that the room was much brighter than we see in the closer shots. Similar to this shot of the crew members standing next to the Nostromo's landing gear, Scott had his 2 young sons, and I believe the cameraman's son, in smaller spacesuits positioned next to the space jockey during the establishing shot to, in essence, double the size of the set in the minds of the audience. By the time they filmed the close-ups though, Giger added a few personal touches to the head and then painted it. To make it look like it was decaying, they added a thin coat of latex rubber and rubbed it to simulate peeling skin. They find a strange hole in the floor, most likely made from the acid blood of whatever popped out of the space jockey's chest.
Bottomless pit.
I think we should go down it, yes?
And Kane repels down into it.
Kane, listen. Don't unhook yourself under any circumstances and be out of there in 10 minutes. You got that?
Yes, got that.
All right, come on.
Can you see anything?
I don't know, a cave. A cave of some sort, but
The egg chamber went through several design iterations. O'Bannon originally wanted the egg chamber to contain only 6 eggs, but Giger and Scott were eventually able to convince him that a hatchery with 6 eggs was ridiculous, and the idea was dropped. Giger also originally envisioned the egg chamber interior to resemble a womb, but this was nixed due to budget constraints. When Giger designed his version of the temple that was cut from the movie, he also came up with the concept for the interior, which more or less became the interior of the egg chamber in the final film. You can see how it has these sort of pie slices in the floor, which looks more like the space jockey room. Well, as another cost-saving measure, they actually shot the egg chamber and the space jockey room on basically the same set. They just removed the space jockey and its platform and added the eggs. They extended the dividers in the wall onto the floor. Here we can see Giger's original concept for the walls of the egg chamber. Scott's original idea that they also had to cut for budget reasons was to have Kane rappel down a long tube with a membrane at the bottom. He cuts through the membrane and lowers into a dark room where hundreds of tiny lights on his suit would turn on and illuminate everything around him. But even though they couldn't do the membrane idea, Scott still wanted there to be something that Kane would pass through that would trigger a response in the eggs. Scott said, "We finally settled on a laser which was mounted so it would scan just above the eggs and give us this sheet of blue light. We could have done a lot more with it, but we didn't have time. As it was, we only had about half a day to test it, and then another day and a half to shoot the whole bloody sequence." In a separate interview, Scott said, "It may have waited thousands of years for some other life form to come near. Its only trigger, you see, is another life form."
There's a layer of mist just covering the eggs that reacts when broken.
Another biological presence enables it to move on and develop. It truly does have an abstract kind of purity.
I admire its purity.
And almost like a weapon, a product of biological rather than bacteriological warfare. One of the more famous bits of trivia is that the laser itself was borrowed from the rock band The Who happened to be filming this on Stage B at Shepperton Studios, right next to where the egg chamber scene was being filmed. The laser was very powerful and was shining on a mirror that oscillated 3,000 times a second, giving the appearance of being flat when the room was filled with smoke. Kane slips and falls through the laser and finds himself face to face with the eggs. If I'm being honest, the slip and fall doesn't look very convincing, but, you know, they only had a bloody day and a half to shoot the bloody sequence. They did a shot with the eggs hanging upside down so that it looked like liquid was strangely dripping up from it.
I did a kind of for the eggs, an area around, very organic, like tentacles, you know. The eggs had been made in polystyrene. They had to be first transparent, that you could see inside the movements of the alien, of the facehugger.
And Scott performed this bit with his hands himself. These eggs don't look like Giger's original concept though. Giger's original design for the egg that was commissioned by O'Bannon looked like this. And there was a problem. When they were discussing the egg concept, Scott thought it looked obscene, and producer Gordon Carroll reminded him what the doors of the Derelict and the alien's head looked like, and everyone in the meeting started cracking up. So to appease Scott, they changed it so the top of the egg would hydraulically open with 4 corners, kind of like a blooming flower. Kane slowly peers into the egg. The inside of the egg was filled with actual sheep and cow organs that they got from a local slaughterhouse and steam cleaned. What we're seeing here is the lining of a cow's stomach. It really gives off a level of verisimilitude that you just can't get with non-organic materials. I mean, just look at the other versions from sequels and spin-offs. Suddenly, a facehugger pops out. Scott said, "I wanted it to happen so fast you could never really see it, like a snake when it attacks. I wanted great violence. I wanted it totally, absolutely lethal. That's the whole reality of a creature like that. To get the effect I wanted, we placed an explosive charge inside the egg. Over that, we put about 40 feet of pig intestines connected to an airline but deflated, coiled around the top of the opening. Then we laid Nottingham lace around the sides. When the explosive charge went off, we hit the air at the same time and the intestines went whoosh." Going through the individual raw shots, I never noticed that there's actually a shot of it piercing the glass of the helmet from Kane's point of view. The facehugger jumping out was done as an insert at Bray Studios, where they did the models. For one of the shots, a guy wore the facehugger like a glove and held onto the lens of the camera. Then he quickly pulled his hand back into the egg and they reversed the footage. On the next episode, we'll take a deep dive into the facehugger itself. But for now, I talked only about the Giger design aspects of the scene, but there's a very important element in this scene that wasn't designed by Giger, and that's the spacesuits. If you head on over to Patreon, you can watch a bonus video on the design of the spacesuits. It's just $1, and it will go into the $5 archive when my next video goes up.